Is the Sony A7IV still worth it in 2025 for wildlife photography and video? We're going to be breaking down all the pros, all the cons, and who I think this camera is really for in 2025 when it comes to wildlife photography and video. So let's jump right into it, and on a positive note, let's go with the pros first. And number one is the video functions. Now, I'm still pretty new to video. I've been doing photography for 6 years, so that's what I know. I really started doing wildlife video about 6 months ago when I actually got this camera. And one of my pledges to myself when actually purchasing this camera was to start doing video. And I am extremely pleased. Now in this camera you can shoot 4K 60p, which is really nice because, you know, the 4K in this camera is great, it's super crisp. And the 60p really allows you to slow down that footage. I slow it down to usually around 50%, and it lets you really just capture every little movement when it comes to the wildlife you are filming. And I think that's really great because, you know, wildlife is beautiful and it really allows you to just slow down the footage and really observe every little movement from your wildlife. And I know the 4K is nice because, you know, it's super crisp and looks really well, but it also allows you to crop into your footage more as well. And typically, you know, with a higher resolution camera, you can crop into your images, and 4K is kind of the same thing. On a high level though, I mean guys, I'm very new to videography, so that's just the way that I see it. And not only does this shoot 4K 60, but it shoots 4K 60 with a crop. Now, if you are a, you know, wedding photographer or a street photographer, you may see this as a big con, but as wildlife photographers, this just allows us to crop even closer to our wildlife, which, you know, can be very difficult sometimes. So basically, you get even closer to your wildlife and you can crop even further, allowing for crispy details up close. And one thing that really helps with my learning of video as well is the S-Cinetone option on this camera. Now with S-Cinetone, I get a really pleasing color that I love, and I don't really need to go in and do a ton of color correction in my video editing software because it looks really good out of camera. You know, of course I am going to be lifting the shadows a little bit and playing around with contrast and correcting any of my white balance, but I don't need to do an extensive color grade, and for someone that's just learning video, that's really amazing. And not only is that great for wildlife photography, but it's great for YouTube as well. You know, I'm really not spending a lot of time color grading my clips, so, you know, this is great not only for advanced videographers, but also really good for beginner videographers, especially if you're coming from photography like I am. And the last note on videography would just have to be the bird IAF. So the autofocus in this camera is actually really good. It is a huge step up from the Sony A7III and A7R3, and probably the A7R4 too. I haven't actually used the A7R4. But the bird IAF not only works in photography, but in video as well. And that's something that, you know, even some of the best Sony cameras like the Sony A1 don't have. Now the bird IAF it's okay. It's not amazing. It's not going to stick to your bird like glue, especially if it's a small bird that's far away, and especially if it's moving very quickly. You know, it's not going to stick to it all the time, but it is very good, and it's a vast improvement again over the predecessors. You know, like the Sony A7III and the Sony A7R3. And we're going to jump right into our next pro here, which is just the autofocus. We've already been talking about the autofocus in video a little bit, and I have mentioned photography a little bit too, but jumping over to photography, this autofocus is really good. Now this camera has 3 autofocus subjects: animals, birds, and humans. Human IF really sticks like glue. I'm never worried about the camera, you know, missing autofocus when I'm filming myself. Animal IF is, you know, dependent on the animal. It really has no issue with bigger mammals, but I do struggle sometimes with reptiles and amphibians. So if you see the picture here of a bullfrog I captured, I was pretty close, and it did actually grab the nose when I was using animal IAF, and I kind of had to move my focusing point towards the eye, at which point it stuck on. But, you know, the animal IAF I find is a little bit hit or miss. And if you are focusing on birds, I would definitely recommend switching directly to the bird IAF, because I do find with the animal IAF on, it doesn't really stick to birds that well. Which is fine because they do have the bird IAF as well. So, you know, with birds, it's not going to stick like glue if the bird is far away and if it's small and if it's moving very rapidly. But you know, it holds its own. It's still really good, and I still use it all the time when I am focusing on birds. So because of this, I actually set up a custom button to swap between bird IAF, human IAF, and animal IAF. And then I usually keep it in zone or wide autofocus with my back button focus. And then I've actually set up another custom function right beside that one to have a spot right in the middle that I can switch to, which is really good if you have, you know, birds in trees with lots of branches, because sometimes it can be difficult for zone to pick up right on that bird. This camera also does have the real-time tracking, which is a function that I was very used to on the A6600, and that's on the A9. It sticks to your subject and you can follow it around the frame. And this is really good, I find, for birds in flight too. So sometimes I set that up instead of wide. And it's really great to have that option as well. So next we're going to talk about the Ergonomics, which I think is another great pro. Again, I came from the Sony A7R III as my main body, and I had the Sony A7 III as kind of a backup, used the A6600, and I've used a lot of Canon cameras as well. And they definitely made this camera a little thicker, which I really like. It definitely feels better in your hands compared to those predecessor cameras. And I think if you have larger hands, you're really gonna like this. And I think if you have smaller hands, it's not gonna deter you either. I think it is truly a great size. And I really appreciate this because in Canada it gets quite cold in the winter, and you know, I can use gloves with this body no problem, and I'm not really, you know, pressing buttons by accident like I might have been doing with my A7R III quite a lot of the time. So yeah, really appreciate that change in ergonomics. You do also have now the flip out rotating screen, which, you know, we didn't have on the A7 III or the A7R III, and you know, that's really good. Gone are the days of having to shoot vertical with your eye right up to the camera when you're laying on the ground. And you know, that's been really nice for things like landscape photography, but also if I'm trying to, you know, post on Instagram and you know, there's some wildlife that I want to shoot, it's nice to rotate that screen, especially, you know, if you're close to water and you want to get a vertical shot. You know, you can kind of put the camera down and rotate it, and it's nice that way. I do have to say I sometimes miss the old flip out screen from the Sony A7R III and Sony A7 III when I'm taking horizontal shots down low, especially for things like macro, because now if you want to take those shots, it is off to the side a little bit, and you know, it has been some trial and error trying to locate those subjects sometimes. And of course, the newer models like the Sony A7R V have that option now for both. It both flips out and rotates out. So, you know, I'd expect the Sony A7V will probably have that too. But I think overall, you know, I am more happy with the rotational screen that doesn't flip out over the one that just flips out. So again, I'm going to say that's a big pro on the ergonomic side. And then of course, you know, this camera has a lot of things that the predecessors have: dual card slots, really good dynamic range, and great low light capability. So, you know, none of that's really changed from the predecessors. And now my last pro that is going to transition into a little bit of a con, depending on who you are. This is very subjective, and that is the megapixels. So this camera is 33 megapixels, which a lot of people love. And I think if you do like weddings and engagements, people photography, 33 is amazing. And I still think it's really good for wildlife too, especially if you're comparing it to the Sony A7 III, which is 24 megapixels. I personally don't think 24 megapixels is enough for me, and I much prefer the 33, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss the 42 from my A7R III. So for me, I think that 40 to 50 range is the sweet spot for megapixels when it comes to wildlife, photography, and cropping. Again, I'm happy with the 33 megapixels, and I think this is pretty subjective. Some people love the 33. I like it, but I do wish it was like 42 megapixels. Because I do think 61 is maybe too much for me. The file sizes are going to be massive, and I have to say the file sizes with 33 megapixels is totally manageable. So again, this is a pro because I do like the 33, but it's going to transition into a con because I'd be lying if I said I don't miss the 42 megapixels. And 33 megapixels is actually pretty good for noise too. So I do find that I can shoot all the way up to, you know, 12,000 ISO with 33 megapixels, and you know, using denoise software, that's no issue at all. So yeah, I do really like the 33 megapixels. So now it's time for the cons, and I do want you to be mindful in the fact that this camera costs around $2,200 USD, or around 3,000 Canadian new, or around 1,800 used USD, and you know, 2,500 new Canadian, depending on, you know, the deal you can find. So let's be mindful of the fact that if any of these cons were rectified, that price is going to go way up, and you're going to be into a much more professional wildlife camera. So keep that in mind. So the first con when it comes to wildlife photography would be the burst rate. Now this camera shoots 6 frames per second in uncompressed RAW or 10 frames per second in compressed RAW with the mechanical shutter. Now personally guys, I always shoot in uncompressed RAW, so I'm always at that 10 frames per second. I don't really feel the need to shoot at uncompressed RAW. You know, maybe if you're pixel peeping, you can see a difference. I personally can't. So, you know, I'll take the higher frame rates and the smaller file sizes that come with compressed RAW any day. But of course, you know, a lot of these other wildlife cameras, even some cameras that are within the same price range as this camera, do have more frames per second. Of course, things like the A9 has 20 frames per second, and even if you go over to, you know, the Canon side of things, you're getting 15 to 20 frames per second with cameras that are, you know, roughly the same price as this camera. Of course, the A1 does 30 frames per second, but that's a much more expensive camera, so we're not even going to compare it to it. Now, 10 frames per second is still pretty good. You know, a lot of these older cameras like the Nikon D850 and even, you know, the Canon 5D Mark IV, which was not a wildlife camera per se, but a lot of people used it for wildlife photography. You know, those cameras all had around 10 frames per second, so this is not a make or break at all. And if anything, it does keep the amount of images you have a little bit down, and that's great for saving space on your computer as well. Of course, I love 15 frames per second or 20 frames per second, but I think 10 frames per second is still fine. It's good enough, but again, it's not great, so we're gonna call that a con for sure. The next one we're gonna talk about here is the rolling shutter. Now this camera also does have some rolling shutter when you get out of that mechanical mode and get into silent mode or the electronic shutter. So you know, that's not great for moving subjects. Of course, if you're trying to do birds silently that are moving, you might get some banding. So, you know, I really do save silent mode for perched animals because obviously you don't want to scare them. And you're likely not going to get any banding if that animal's just perched anyway. So if you do look at things like the Sony A9, similar price to this camera, that, you know, you can shoot silent mode while birds are flying and you're not going to get banding in your images. So one thing to take into account, if silent mode is really important for you, you know, there might be better options. But again, I'm pretty much always using mechanical, and I'll just switch to silent if, you know, that bird is perched and I don't want to scare it. Now this camera does have some blackout as well, so, you know, when you are spraying and praying with those 10 frames per second, you know, you're going to get blackout in between each shot. And, you know, I'm quite used to that because I've come from the A7IV and the A7R3, A6600, which all had blackout. So, you know, I'm not really ever losing birds in flight during that blackout just because I'm so used to it. But if you're coming from the A9 thinking about coming up to this camera, then that's one thing, yeah, you know, you might be not used to, is that you'll get blackout in between your images. And if we want to say, you know, one con for video, and, you know, this is really nitpicky because, you know, you got to know this coming into this camera, is that it will not shoot 4K 120p. And that allows you to slow down the motion a lot. And, you know, you will get 120 in 1080p, which is still pretty good as long as you're not cropping. But, you know, one thing to realize is that you're not going to get 4K 120 in this camera. And that might be a turnoff for some people, but it wasn't a turnoff for me. I think that 4K 60 is really good, but just something to know that, you know, you won't get that 4K 120. But let's be real, guys. If we got 4K 120, we got 20 to 30 frames per second, we got no banding, no blackout, plus all the other features of this camera, you're looking at a $6,000 camera because, you know, that's like A1 levels. So, you know, if those are the cons, I am taking those cons all day versus all those pros we talked about first. Okay, it's a time you've all been waiting for. Who the heck is this camera for? So first and foremost, I think this camera is for hybrid shooters. If you're doing wildlife photography, wildlife video, and, you know, a little bit of landscape photography, some macro photography, some macro video, I think this camera is going to be amazing. It is a generalist, you know. It does everything pretty well. Nothing amazing in my mind. But that's great for, you know, us intermediate, semi-pro maybe, or, you know, high-end enthusiast wildlife photographers that want to get great video, great stills, birds in flight a little bit. If you are also a little bit of hybrid between wildlife and people, you know, if you do wildlife photography and macro photography, landscape photography, but you also, you know, shoot weddings, engagements, family photos. I myself used to do that and still do it a little bit now just to finance my wildlife photography. You know, it's going to be amazing for those people, photo shoots that you're doing, and it's also really going to hold its own in the wildlife photography side as well, and wildlife video. So I really don't think it's just hybrid to photo and video. I think it's a hybrid to subject types as well. I also think it's just for, you know, those intermediate to maybe even professional photographers that just don't have the budget for something like a Sony A1. You know, you want higher megapixels than the A9, you want really good autofocus capabilities, you want really good video features, but you can't really afford something like the A1. I think that this is a really good step down from the A1. And, you know, I think it's also really good for those professional wildlife photographers that, you know, do this as a full-time career. You might have something like the A1 or the A1 II or the A9 III, those really high-end wildlife photography and video cameras, and you're looking for a backup camera, something that can hold its own if something happens to one of those cameras, or, you know, even do a little behind the scenes B-roll shots while you're doing, you know, your regular videos. I think that this camera is an excellent backup camera, and, you know, if the time ever comes where I do upgrade to something like an A1, then I'll certainly be keeping this as a backup 100%. And that's something, you know, that I love because The A7 III was my backup camera, and going from the A7R III to the A7 III, I always really just wish I had a second A7R III at the time. And the A7R III would have been a great backup to this camera. So I just think that this is an excellent backup camera. If you can't afford two A1s, I can't even afford one A1, so excellent backup camera. Okay, who is this camera not for? This camera is not for people that are only interested in wildlife photography. They don't want to do any video. If you don't want to do any video, I think that there are better cameras to pick up, particularly if you are interested in birds in flight, and birds in flight are really important to you and video is not important to you. I think that you could find a used A9 or even a used A9 Mark II. And if you get the Mark I, you're gonna have a little bit of extra money to put it towards a lens. And the A9 II used, it's gonna be a little bit more expensive than this camera, but not by a lot. They are very similar in price. So I think that either of those two cameras are gonna be much better just for stills and birds in flight. There's gonna be no blackout, you're gonna get a higher frames per second, no banding when you're in silent mode. It's just a better camera for birds in flight and stills. But those cameras don't have the best video capabilities. There's no 4K 60, so something to think about. And finally, if you have the budget for an A1, and maybe you've heard, hey, why are you buying an A1 when you could save money and get an A7IV? It's not an A1, okay? If you have the budget for an A1 and you're just looking for a cheaper alternative, but the same functions, this camera's not for you. Get the A1 because it's much better than this camera, reflected very much in the price. But if you're just looking to save money for the same functions, it's not going to work for you. So, if you have the price for an A1, get the A1. It's a much better camera, of course, but, just something to think about because I have seen that kind of floating around. It's like a baby A1 and, save your money. Definitely not the case. So guys, I hope you liked this video and I hope it helped you, try to decide if you are going to pick up the A7 IV in 2025. Personally, I definitely still recommend this camera for wildlife photography and wildlife video. I think it's great for the price that you're getting it for. And let me know in the comments, are you thinking about picking this up? Are you gonna wait for the A7V? Very curious to see what those kind of specs are gonna be. And remember too that the lens is so much more important than the actual body. I'd rather spend like 70% of my budget on a great lens than a great body. And I'd also rather have, an A7 III with some really nice glass than an A7 IV with a kit lens or something. So, glass is so much more important than your camera. So remember that too. And if you like this video, click here.